Hey guys, Sleepy Reader here. This is part two of my sort of personal history and comic books. My memories of my childhood. I'm kind of walking through my memories, looking for significant little things to share with you. Um, because I feel comic books shaped me in some way, I guess. So, the most embarrassing thing I ever did for a comic book was in fifth grade. I asked a girl to go steady with me, and then I went steady with her so that I could read one comic book. The comic book, I know it was a Lee Kirby comic book. I think it was this one, Fantastic Four number 100. And although the Lee Kirby era was over, I had read enough comic books to have somehow gleaned that that was when the really great comic books were, and I could recognize it a few rows of desks over. These kids were passing back and forth this comic that I knew was one of the really good ones. And I have no idea how many comic books I'd read by that point, but I would guess less than 10. And I was obsessed. I couldn't get a hold of comic books, and I wanted more. And so I pretty much begged these guys to let me read it, or somehow tipped my hand as to how desperate I was. And they said, you can read this comic book if you ask Joanne to go steady with you. And going steady was what some boys and girls in fifth grade did, the ones who were a little more advanced, I guess, because I still hadn't gotten over the days of being a member of the Girl Haters Club in fourth grade. But I did have a crush on Joanne, and I don't think they knew that. They might have just been choosing someone they thought would be a little embarrassing to go out with, or I don't know, maybe not. And I remember Joanne quite clearly. I remember her last name. I won't say it here. But the thought of even talking to a girl back then was a little beyond me. But I wanted to read that comic book so much. I went up to Joanne and I asked her to go steady, and she said yes, which blew my mind. And what you did when you went steady, as far as I know, was you passed notes back and forth in class. And so we passed a few notes back and forth. We sat together in the back of the social studies class and held hands while they showed us a video or a film. They didn't have videos back then, a film strip of some kind. And I never got to read the comic book. Those little twerps, even after I asked, they probably got the biggest kick out of the fact that I actually did what they told me to do. Even though I asked Joanne to go steady with me, they did not let me read that comic book. I think, there was, especially because of the way Marvel comics were back then, with the checklist and the bullpen page, and there were lots of reprints from the Lee Kirby era and the Steve Ditko era. So you could accidentally come across that history, or maybe you could also, easily stumble over a used copy of one of those books. I remember getting some used comic books at farm stands. They'd have a little box off to the side while your parents were picking out corn. You were looking through the book of comic books. So and somehow, anyway, I researched as deeply as I could through any of these comic books. I'd read the little indica at the bottom of the splash page and pour over all the letters pages and everything I could get. So somehow I knew that these books were the ones. But I think I would have been crazy about reading any comic book. So yeah, that's the most embarrassing thing. And and the thing was, I was really excited to be going steady with a girl, and with this girl in particular, I think. But I didn't understand it all, and I wrote her a note that said, "Are we really going steady together?" And she wrote me back and said, "I guess we aren't really going steady together." And that was the end of that. And I probably never talked to another girl for 3 or 4 years. So yeah, and I think I know a couple times I stole comic books out of a pharmacy, and I got caught. Um, but anyway, skipping ahead a bit, I think when I was about 13, I discovered that there was a comic book store, and I never even knew the existence of comic book stores before discovering this. It was called Snipe Hunt, and it was near where my grandmother lived in Manhattan. She had a very tiny one-bedroom apartment in a pretty nice part of Manhattan, East 86th Street. And wandering around that area when visiting her, and you can imagine, it was incredibly exciting to visit Manhattan when you lived out in a rural area, where there wasn't even a grocery store in your town, and then you're in the middle of Manhattan. So visiting my grandmother was exciting enough, and then I discovered this comic book store, which was probably the size of the room that I'm in right now. It was a tiny little thing, just jam-packed with comic books, and it was so exciting. And I think that greatly increased my access to comic books at that point. Of course, I only visited my grandmother every now and then. But when I was sent off to summer camp when I was 13, I asked her to pick up some comic books for me, specifically Savage Sword of Conan #1 and Planet of the Apes #1. They must have come out the same month or something. And somehow I knew they were coming out from an ad in a comic book. But I knew it would have been really hard for me to find them, and doubly hard for me to find them while I was at summer camp. So she braved going into a comic book store, and she sent me that care package. And thinking back, I wonder if I ever thanked her. But, inside my little primitive 13-year-old brain, that was a really great thing. And it was like made summer camp that much more bearable and interesting. It was something to really look forward to, was to come back to my cabin and go up in my bunk and look through Savage Sword of Conan again, or admire Mike Ploog's artwork in Planet of the Apes. And my grandmother had gone through World War II. She was a German Jew, and her health was really bad, and it was hard for her even to walk more than a few city blocks. And she was kind of this real old school, in Germany, she, instead of going to high school, she went to finishing school and that kind of thing. And the whole idea of comic books, and I was this little savage to her. She didn't understand any of the kinds of things that interested me, but she still, went out to the comic book store and found these particular issues, with naked barbarians on the cover, and sent them to me. So that was a real great thing. She died when I was 18, and I don't know if I ever thanked her for any of the things she did for me. So, that's just sort of a memory that particularly stands out in my head. There's lots of reasons for being bad with girls, or I was poor socially, going back to when I was in 5th grade. I was very socially inept. And I'd been at that school starting in 4th grade. And I think by the end of 4th grade, I felt like I was just beginning to be accepted. And then in 5th grade, all the rules changed. Lots of boys started liking girls. Some of the more sophisticated boys and girls actually had little parties together. I was never invited to those. And I think there were a couple reasons why I was socially inept. One, was just the obvious, not developing as fast as some people. But another was I had really bad eyesight. I could not see across the room, and it was only like in the middle of the year in 5th grade that I got glasses. But I have a feeling there had been several years where I needed vision correction. And so it always made me kind of a space cadet and bad at sports, because I just didn't know what was going on. I was shocked when I got glasses and found out you were supposed to be able to see the board at the front of the class and see what the teacher was doing. So looking back on it, and this is something I've only thought about in the last year or so, about how bad my vision probably was and no one knew it, that was part of my social ineptness. And the other thing is that basically throughout all my schooling, I went to a different school at the most, well, I stayed at the same school at the most for 2 years at a time, and then we moved on, or I moved on. So like after 5th grade, I then 6th grade spent in Hawaii, which actually wasn't bad. I had a good time in Hawaii. But it was nerve-wracking, like those first few months, every time you switch schools. And if you do that almost every year, it's very hard. And so that, along with my kind of being different from the rest of my family kind of aspects that I mentioned in my first video, I think added to the power of comics. And comic books, especially those Marvel comics with all the stuff Stan Lee was doing with making them more sort of friendly. It was like your happy uncle, and you imagine there was this kind of cool place where people all worked together to make comic books, the bullpen. It just gave you like a different vision of life than the one you were in right now. It's not all downsides to moving around all the time, I have to say. And one of the upsides I discovered was that you gain a certain sense of independence from what your designated role is. Like, what I mean is, in one school, I would be the loser nerd who kids sat on top of every day after recess. In 4th grade, I had to finally realize I had to beat up my meanest bully in front of everybody, and then everybody joined in and helped me, and everything turned around, and I had friends. That was a big lesson. But my point is, then I would go to another school. Like when I was 7, I went to school in Palo Alto, California, and that was great. And I had a great time, and I felt kind of cool. I mean, I don't know if other people thought I was. But then 3rd grade, I felt very uncool. Then 4th grade, I kind of fought my way up to being sort of accepted. And then in Hawaii, I had a great time there and felt fairly accepted, even though I was a Howley, which was a little bit of a downside there. And I think over time, you gain a sense of yourself separate from your role at school because of this extreme changes of your role in different schools. And I have some friends that I know who kind of identify themselves with this role they got stuck in at school, staying at the same school and with the same kids, for 12 years. And so I feel like I was kind of freed of that, and I've always carried with me an inner sense of the self being, you are who you are, and it's not who people think you are or what they have to do with you. And I think it's kind of and I bet a lot of us in the comic book community have this feeling. It's kind of you're not an alpha male and you're not a beta male or whatever, or female. You're not a follower or a leader. You're a lone wolf. You're someone who makes themselves. And it's what's inside your head ultimately that counts. Kind of existentialism, self-creation. And I think comic books played a role in that because they gave me this separate world. I didn't really share it with anybody. I mean, I did try to share it with my brother, but just this separate imaginative world that you built up in your own head, and it gave you a little more of that strength to self-create, if that makes any sense. I think in Hawaii, while I lived in Hawaii, I very occasionally got comic books. There wasn't regular access to comic books, again, like elsewhere. But I was 11 there. I was having a good time. And I do remember discovering near the end of my stay in Hawaii that one of my friends had a box this tall full of comic books. And I managed to borrow that box from him for a few days and read a lot of those comic books. When I was 14, we lived for a year in Geneva, Switzerland, which is a pretty cool experience also. But again, at that age, there's some excitement to being in another country and everything, but it was also hard, as always, starting over. But it was a little better because I was at the international school, so it was sons and daughters of people who worked for international organizations. So they were kind of a middle class jet set in a way. They may have moved around the world, but their parents had kind of, mid-level for the most part, bureaucratic jobs. And so I had friends there from Sweden and Poland and the UK and Australia and the US and other places, India. But I really missed comic books. There was only comic books in French. And not until sort of the end of our stay there could I potentially read French. And the only comic book I could find in this store, in the neighborhood we lived in, there was a cigar store. And for some reason, it had the Warren Spirit books. And I don't have any of them anymore. They looked somewhat like this. This is a kitchen sink spirit book, but they were oversized. And each issue reprinted like 8 spirit stories, the 7-page spirit stories from the 40s. And so because it's the only comic book that was available to me at the time, I bought some spirits when I could afford it. And they were so good when I, was forced to just focus on them. And it kind of was a new level of sort of intellectual development and appreciation of comic books. That, I still loved the Marvel comic books, but it gave me something else, a view of a broader range of comic books. And that was really exciting. So I think from there on, as I, came back to the U.S. or went to that comic book store near my grandmother's, or maybe even in college when I came back to comic books after my few years of thinking I was too into girls to spend much time on comic books, I always looked for the more interesting things or for the more non-mainstream things, and I think it started with the spirit. And when I had a lot, especially at first when I hadn't made many friends and didn't speak French, I was able to spend a lot of time closely examining the spirit comics, which are such a unique and wonderful piece of art. I'm just almost randomly picking some panels there, but they were just very intense. Later, actually, one of the few times I had a friend who liked comic books was in Switzerland, and I only discovered that, I guess at the second half of the year, and he and I split an international subscription to the Hands of Shang-Chi. And that was during the Paul Gulacy period, I believe. So we both read the first 6 issues, and I got to keep them, and then I headed back to the United States, and he got the last 6 issues. But anything to read a comic book, and I guess I couldn't afford an international subscription all on my own. Or maybe I had to have it come to his address so my parents wouldn't know about it. I'm not sure which. And I also discovered near the end of my stay in Switzerland, in Geneva, these old magazine stores that sold old used magazines. I think they mostly made their money off old Playboys and stuff. But they had these old, or not so old, black and white British comics that reprinted American Marvel comics. But each one would have like 3 stories, and each of those would be half an issue, like half an issue of Tomb of Dracula, half an issue of Frankenstein, and half an issue of The Mummy, say, in the horror comic. So I grabbed a bunch of those, and they were all half issues scattered all over the place, and that sort of gave me a big infusion, actually, of more Marvel knowledge, but it was bits and pieces all over the place, which is kind of, in a way, the way all of my childhood reading of Marvel comics was. So anyway, then I'm just going to hit one last place. I know I've run on really long, and this is already part 2. But when I was 15, so after Switzerland, my parents decided that I was too rebellious, or I wasn't focused enough on being a student, and so they sent me off to an all-boys Catholic boarding school. and my grandmother paid for it. She had money at that point. And it turned out to be this. It was a boarding school that in my dad's day was famous for funneling people to Harvard University. And believe me, it wasn't like that by the 70s. And the late 70s, I guess. I think it was mostly not too bright, and not the stupidest people in the world, but not terribly bright, rich Catholic boys who were sent there. And so I soon found that I didn't fit in at all. I mean, they could even you had to wear a jacket and tie to class, and they could tell by my jacket and tie that I didn't have money. And I just in so many ways didn't fit in there. But the great thing for me was they gave you a $4 a week allowance. And my parents may have given me 75 cents a week or $1 a week. So anyway, suddenly I had a lot more money. And in my loneliness, I would do this really long walk to a convenience store and buy comic books there every week. And I even somehow got a hold of the heavy metal comics. So I read a lot of comics there. And not to say I had no friends there, but it just was kind of an odd place. And, like one of the people around me, their parents were millionaires, and millionaires in the 70s. And some of them, like, if I remember correctly, one of them was a nephew of Marcos, who was the dictator of the Philippines. Another, the drug dealer in my dorm, was the son of the mayor of Miami. I think these memories are correct. I also got, little tinges of anti-Semitism here and there, and I'm actually half Catholic, half Jewish, and that made me very uneasy. I mean, my last name is my father's name, so it was a nice Anglo-Saxon kind of name. But anyway, so I felt just not fitting in there at all. And I spent a lot of time actually listening to my little radio, listening to rock and roll and reading comic books and doing a lot of drawing. I found that was the first time. The one good thing at this Catholic boys' school was they had a dedicated art teacher who had been a professional commercial artist before he retired, and he just for fun taught art classes at the school. And so we did real anatomy and real drawing, and I excelled in that because of all my time spent in comic books. So the class where I was the top dog, or so I felt, was the drawing class, and I had a lot of fun in that. So yeah, and it's rare actually that you get a good art class. A lot of art classes are bogus, and that was a really good one. But and then my last 2 years of high school, I went to a much better school, an alternative school, with kind of, the whole 70s alternative school kind of thing going on near where my parents lived. But yeah, I'm kind of fizzling out here. But those are kind of three of the points I wanted to hit. And I do think of comic books as something that just helped me become who I am, separate from other pressures in life. And I feel, now that I think about it, now that I say it, I feel I see that in our YouTube community. Everyone's way of doing their videos is completely different, and there's no conformity of thought. We all like different things. We all like comic books, and that brings us together, but we're all very different people. Maybe it would be hell if we were all in the same room, but it's fun, each individually speaking with each our individual voice. So anyway, maybe I'll do a part 3 someday. There might be stuff worth saying about my coming back to comic books in college. But I look forward. I've seen some really good videos lately on personal history. There's Why Not Art just did one, which was excellent. Oh, and there's another guy who I just started subscribing to, and I'm forgetting his name. I'll look for it and I'll put a link below. And then HowlwerMouse did one recently also that was excellent. And I'll put a link to my first personal history. And also, because I think it kind of ties in, a long time ago, early in my YouTube days, like 5 months ago, I did a video called Why Are Comic Books So Addictive? And I think that ties into all of this too. So I'll talk to you all later. I hope you're doing well.